Hi, my name is Aljana, and in this module, I will be discussing the study of deductive arguments and how to determine the difference between a valid and an invalid argument. According to Acuña, deductive arguments are the most unfamiliar type of reasoning because it's abstract and counterintuitive, meaning that these are theories and concepts and they go against the common sense expectations of how we think. However, it is still important to study this because the typology of arguments will be incomplete without it, and deductive logic is necessary as they are additional skills needed in philosophical analysis. The subject form of logic, or FDL, is the study of valid and invalid argument forms. Logicians strip the statements of their meaning and content and then determine whether the argument form is valid or not. It does not matter how many premises are given as long as you only have one conclusion. The FDL has two truth values only, which are true and false. Here's an example. As you can see, the first two statements are premises, and it is followed by a conclusion. Logicians have come up with a way to inspect an argument structure. If you look at the previous example, that is what you call a modus ponens. It is the formula if P implies Q, which makes inspecting the argument a lot easier now that we have a truth table. Here's an example. To know if an argument is invalid is when the premise or premise set is true and the conclusion is false. In this argument form, which is the opposite of modus ponens, is called affirming the consequent, also known as a formal fallacy. Otherwise, it would be considered a valid argument. Here's an example of the difference between the structures of a valid and invalid argument. A deductive argument is a type of reasoning made up of a premise and a conclusion wherein the meaning of the word true and false are not empirical, which is why some logicians use 1 for true and 0 for false to avoid the attached meaning of the two truth values. To sum things up, just remember what Max Hokut said, which was, logic is deductive, reasoning is valid or invalid. Formal logicians only care about the structure of an argument rather than its content. Deductive logic is a formal science. Therefore, the logic presented will not help you understand the content of the argument because its focus is on its structure. In this next unit, we will now talk about the procedures in making an argument and how to criticize its strength in preparation of a counter-argument. Arguments and counter-arguments are the main intellectual instruments that are essential in philosophical thesis. Learning these will help you become a critical thinker. As discussed in the previous module, logical forms are formal systems that focus on the structure of the argument, whether they are valid or invalid argument forms. We will now tackle informal logic, which is the study of various types of arguments in ordinary discourse. This time, you identify, analyze, evaluate the content of the argument and not focus on the structure or template like you do in formal logic. According to Gauvier, they deal with topics of controversy, disputed facts, plausible hypotheses, approximately correct analogies. To evaluate them, we must sort out ambiguities, see how diverse factors fit together, weigh pros and cons, consider the credibility on whom we may depend on for credibility and expertise. As stated previously, informal logic is identifying, understanding, analyzing, and evaluating arguments in ordinary discourse, and it is not focused on the structure or template like you do in formal logic. Here's an example. The argument form is in a valid form, But if you take a look at its content, the conclusion does not follow the first two premises because the rain may not be enough to fill the dam. Another definition, as stated by Ralph H. Johnson, informal logic is a branch of logic whose task is to develop non-formal standards, criteria, procedures for the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, criticism, and construction of argument in everyday discourse. It is logic that is concerned with various types of content in different language games, which is why the domain of informal logic is wide and complicated. Here are some of the issues in informal logic. 1. An argument was not given a precise definition. 2. There is no exact way of determining how a premise should be related to a conclusion. 3. Informal logicians are yet to find a criterion for evaluating and criticizing arguments. 4. The study of arguments and informal logic relies upon language games and as much as possible should be specific. 5. The criteria for evaluating and critiquing an argument depends on one language game to another. And 6. In studying an argument, we must not have any preconceived notions, because if we do not find these notions in discourse, there is a tendency to invent them. Now that we have tackled both deductive and informal logic, let us now go to the next module that will be discussed by Shaina.
Thank you, Aljana, for the thorough discussion about formal deductive logic and the subject matter of informal logic. Now, I am going to discuss Module 2 of Unit 4, which tackles about the theory of argument. The proposed theories of argument in Acuña's book presumes that any theory of argument must facilitate the acquisition of a step-by-step procedure that transmits analytical skills in composing arguments. These analytical skills include the metacognitive skill of criticizing a composed argument, which helps in preparing for a counter-argument, and the megacognitive skill of assessing the strength of both the arguments and counter-arguments. In this regard, one has the goal of strengthening the weaker argument. In relation to this, Acuña sketched his theory by using the model of Ralph Johnson in order for him to remain in accordance with the language game of informal logicians. In Ralph Johnson's requirement for a theory of argument, it must have two components, namely, theory of analysis and theory of appraisal. Now, let us discuss the tasks of these two components. The task of theory of analysis is to give an answer to the definition, purpose, and typology of argument, while theory of appraisal has the task of establishing the criteria for evaluation and criticism of argument that would determine its strengths and weaknesses. Now, since we have been talking about the argument, let us define it. In defining what an argument is, Acuña proposes a practical analytic definition that is not too exact because this might cause the exclusion of genuine arguments from other language games. On the other hand, if it is too loose, it might include a discourse without any discernible premise or conclusion, as stated by Acuña. To quote an argument, it is any discourse, whether oral or written, in which some statements are used as a reason, justification, or evidence to support the claim of another statement. The claim of a statement may be something true, false, or probable, something good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. The part of the discourse used to support a claim is called the conclusion. Three types of argument can be discriminated against, viz., analytic, empirical, and evaluative. The aforementioned definition of an argument is wide and loose enough to cover almost all types of arguments in any language game. It provides the practical advantage of being able to organize and categorize naturally occurring arguments in ordinary discourse. The definition implies that it is an argument if a discourse has a discernible claim, may it be an opinion, belief, knowledge claim, act, choice, decision, or proposal that is supported by evidence, justifications, or reasons. An explanation that contains a discernible claim that is supported by reason or pieces of evidence is an explanation that contains an argument. For example, a single skyflakes cracker has 54 holes because all of the skyflakes cracker I have encountered have 54 holes. In addition to this, Acuña states that these are the objectives of informal logic. For the first one, we have to understand how a conclusion is supported by the premises in a discourse in a natural language. For the second one, we have to develop the criteria for judging whether the support offered by the premises is very strong, fair, weak, or poor. In Acuña's book, he agrees with the informal logicians that the purpose of an argument is quote-unquote, the practice of argumentation is teleological. Argumentation clearly serves to help us achieve many different goals, among them persuasion, justification, inquiry, belief maintenance, decision-making, and so forth. In simple terms, if the intended goal is met, then the argument is successful. This means that the purpose of an argument has been achieved if its conclusion is strongly supported by its premises and can convince a critical thinker. We must also take note that as critical thinkers, unless the premise is very strong, we must evaluate the premises in support of the conclusion first, before accepting the conclusion of any argument. Now, we're going to discuss the types of argument under theory of analysis. But before we start discussing the three types of arguments, Acuña states that the question, how many types of arguments are there, is difficult to answer with finality, especially that we are discussing the subject matter of informal logic, wherein the study of arguments depends on the language game. For this reason, any classification must be temporary. Nevertheless, if categories are specified in an argument, borderline cases can be offered. He proposes a typology of arguments rooted in epistemic claims, namely empirical, analytic, and evaluative. For the first type, we have empirical argument. If a conclusion of an argument is claimed to be empirically true, false, or probable, then it may be an opinion, belief, or knowledge claim. For example, we have most roses are red because all of the roses that I have seen are red. The argument formed from the characteristic of a sample, which is specific, to the characteristic of a population, which is general, will then provide us with an empirical argument in the form of generalization. In order to validate if the conclusion is true or probable, the premises should provide evidence, such as observations and studies. We should take note that if the conclusion is empirical, its premises that are relevant to it should also be empirical. If an argument has an analytic conclusion and is supported by an analytic definition that is a well-formed formula of some formal science, it is called an analytic argument. For example, this pendant must be a cube because it is a three-dimensional square that contains 6 square faces. The given example is analytic because the proof that is required to confirm the truth of the conclusion is the analytic definition. All cubes are three-dimensional squares that contain 6 square faces. The last type is evaluative argument. This type of argument includes moral, legal, religious, and aesthetic arguments. An argument is said to be evaluative if its conclusion claims that an act, behavior, or event is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral, desirable or undesirable. For example, it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun because this is a violation of his or her human right. Every human being should be treated with respect and dignity. There is no known society or culture in the world that will sanction the torture of a human being for fun. With this given example by Acuña, let us dissect and discuss this argument for us to better understand what makes up an evaluative argument. So here we have the conclusion: it is morally wrong to torture a human being for fun. It is a conclusion that is supported by either empirical or evaluative reasons that are like a moral rule. Then we have the premise: violates human rights, which is an evaluative premise. Then we have every human being should be treated with respect and dignity, which is an evaluative premise that is a moral rule. And lastly, the premise: there is no known society or culture in the world that will sanction the torture of a human being for fun, is an empirical premise. So here we will see that when we accept the empirical premise and the evaluative premises to be true, then we cannot help but accept the conclusion and verify it. So here we will see that the premises provides a very strong support to its conclusion. So here we have the variation of evaluative argument. We have the command form, for example, you should not throw trashes anywhere. Then we have the legal or policy proposal form, for example, environmental destruction should be considered a heinous crime. So in an evaluative argument, it is important to take note that the premise of an evaluative conclusion could be a combination of empirical and evaluative premises. The truth requirement is considered to be irrelevant to an evaluative premise or conclusion. It is only applicable to an empirical argument. So the basis of acceptability here is the strength of intersubjective consensus from the concerned audience, wherein they will see if the premise and conclusion are both correct. The technique of persuasion here is when you accept the premise as correct, then you must also accept the conclusion is correct too. In an evaluative argument, we state reasons that justify the conclusion that has different degrees of support, namely very strong, strong, moderately strong, weak, poor, or no support. Now, let us move on to the next component of theory of argument, which is theory of appraisal. Acuña states that the basic goal of the theory of appraisal is to provide the criteria for judging the strength of support offered by the premise to the claim of the conclusion and ask what is the nature of the claim of the conclusion, whether it is analytic, empirical, or evaluative, and what is required evidence or justification to prove the conclusion's claim. With this, Acuña states that a good theory of appraisal can figure out the different kinds of epistemic claims and find out the required evidence or justification to establish the claim. Other than this, the theory must be able to provide the criteria for estimating the epistemic force of reason or evidence that supports the different kinds of claims. This means that the argument becomes conclusive if it's given evidence by the premise that is said to verify, confirm, or justify the claim of the conclusion concurs with the required evidence. The closer to the required evidence, the stronger the argument. Now, let us give out some examples to understand it better. Suppose that the given conclusion is most politicians are corrupt. In this claim, the needed evidence to completely verify the claim is 50% plus 1% of the politician population is corrupt. Another example is most teachers are underpaid. Just like the aforementioned example, the required evidence is 50% plus 1% of the teacher population is underpaid. This shows that the argument becomes stronger if the evidence offered by the premise is closer to the required evidence. According to Acuña, without this initial information, our technique in evaluating and criticizing arguments would not be set in motion. This means that the theory of appraisal can only be developed in the context of different types of argument. Moreover, the criteria for evaluation and criticism must be individualized to the type of argument under consideration, wherein it is also the best way to conceptualize the concept of premise relevance. With that said, we are now going to discuss how to determine whether a premise is relevant or not. Just like what was stated earlier, the premise is relevant to the conclusion if it can verify, confirm, or justify the claim of the conclusion. To quote, in Acuña's book it states that the stronger the support, the greater the relevance. Hence, the concept of premises relevance is susceptible to degrees also. In line with this, we are now going to discuss the criteria for judging the argument strength of the three types of argument. The strength of an empirical argument is dependent on the evidence provided by its premises to justify the probability of the conclusion. Strong evidence provided by the premise makes the probability of the conclusion to be true in a higher degree of support. Therefore, it is susceptible to degrees such as strong, very strong, fair, weak, or poor. For example, more likely than not, James has big eye bags because James is a college student, and most college students are sleep deprived. For the next one, we have analytic argument. Its strength depends on how accurate or correct the definition is in the language of science, or what we call a well-formed formula of some formal science. It is not susceptible to degrees like empirical argument. For example, platypuses have mammary glands, and all animals with mammary glands are mammals. Therefore, all platypuses are mammals. Lastly, we have evaluative argument. Its strength depends on the acceptance of the public or the intersubjective consensus when it comes to morals and principles that is provided to justify the claim. The claim may be either accepted or rejected. Both the premises and conclusion are loose and may vary from different audiences. For example, Pedro should not be punished. Although he is accused of a crime, he is innocent, and we should never punish an innocent person. To summarize this module of Acuña's book, he offered two theories of theory of argument, and these are theory of analysis and theory of appraisal. The theory of analysis offered a working definition of argument retaining the traditional structure of premises, support, conclusion, and the tentative pluralistic typology of arguments. Acuña states that it seems that if informal logic is to be the study of argument in its natural setting, pluralism is favored and monism is rejected, meaning it cannot be confined to just a single standardized form. As stated earlier, informal logic is concerned with various types of content in different language games, which is why the domain of informal logic is wide and complicated. It is not too exact nor too loose.